Hello there, and thank you for joining me, Fiona Sincotta, here at StoneX. And today I'm joined by Ed Phelps, who is Head of Sales and Strategy at StoneX. So thank you very much for coming to join us. And we're coming together to talk at quite a key time in your industry. Tell me about the changes that are happening, but first, tell me a little bit more about what you do here at StoneX.
Brilliant. Thanks for having me, Fiona. I'm part of StoneX Technology Services. We were acquired by StoneX 6 years ago with a specific mandate to help the operational and efficiency side of our payments business, where we process payments to the emerging markets. And the channel in which we send those payments overseas is over the SWIFT network. So we are a SWIFT bureau, a SWIFT service provider, and we look to help our StoneX payments organization with the processing of those payments, with our correspondent banking network, of which spans globally, and we have 350 plus relationships. So we really help with the pipes and the plumbing of that payments business. And since our acquisition, we've been able to expand our services across the group. So with securities and commodities, helping anything from post-trade settlement or other sort of pipes and plumbing topics in both commodities and securities.
Okay, so there's also this big change. We're on the countdown, about a year to go. Explain what change this is for us.
Yes, absolutely. So we have 12 months to go until the migration of the payments industry, really, the new payment standard. So effectively what that is the SWIFT network is moving from its current message format to a brand new message format. And really, the drivers for that change are for more richer data and more structure around that data, with the objective to reduce things like money laundering, to make payments more efficient and enable banks and corporates and everyone connected in that ecosystem to do more business together in a more streamlined and efficient way with more structured data. So it's a bit of a mouthful, but it's called the ISO 20022 migration. And it's, as I mentioned, it's happening at the moment. We're in a coexistence period, which means we have the old standard and the new standard. But the old standard is set to be decommissioned next year with some nuances, which we'll touch upon.
Okay. Now, I understand you had an event here where you had sort of 42 people, 35 different banks, and you were sort of discussing the challenges and the processes perhaps that were going to be used in order to achieve this transformation. So how is it that you're sort of helping guide the banks? What are their challenges? What have they been saying?
Yes, so last week we hosted an event with the Association of Foreign Banks. We put together a panel with SWIFT and another bank to really provide perspectives of how they're approaching this migration, the deadline next year, but also the challenges which have been presented by this migration. So what we discussed was, is everybody going to be ready for the migration? I think broadly the answer is yes. But it's what's going to happen between now and then. So between now and November next year, between November 2025 and 2026, and then 26 and beyond, because of those nuances which I mentioned. So some messages will continue to exist on the SWIFT network under contingency measures. So there'll be charges applied. There'll be additional technical work banks and anyone who's processing cross-border payments over SWIFT will have to adhere to if they're not going to be ready for the migration deadline. So we discussed that. We had a good sort of representation from big banks, small banks, from ourselves, as a non-bank payment service provider, and SWIFT as well, to give an update on the migration itself.
Okay. And so what is the approach? What needs to be done between now and that key date in November?
So not to go into too much detail, but I mean, broadly we see a handful of approaches. One is the bank will update its core system. So this is a core banking software system, which will run the bank from the front all the way through to the middle and the back office. And that in itself is a big project. So upgrading their core systems is years of work, lots of cost, and it's a logistical nightmare because you have to bring everyone in from your retail bank to your commercial bank to all the way across the organization. It's very expensive. It's time consuming. So that is route number one. You update your systems and you can natively process this new language. Option number two is you're not going to be ready, but you're going to use some kind of translation, which will translate the old to the new format. So you effectively insulate your core software. And the third option is kind of a mix between the two, where you may not know when your core systems are going to be ready. So you use translation as a sort of a tactical solution whilst you work out, when you're actually going to be ready to process the new messages in time for the deadline.
Okay. And now I've heard you sort of mention previously talking about sort of working as efficiently as possible, potentially doing the minimum necessary. Is that sort of the approach that you'd suggest taking?
Yeah. So the key message that we want to convey is that we strongly encourage banks to stay on the same path they were. And why we encourage that is because Swift have put a lot more emphasis on the instruction messages, so sending messages. And they are the ones which are going to be kind of that, let's say, baseline of what needs to be done by November next year. Following November 2025, then of course, the focus, the spotlight then looks on the reporting or let's say the messages they'll be receiving. So the non-instruction messages, things like statements. And that's sort of a logical approach towards this migration, where you can sort of slice and dice it and it becomes more manageable rather than consuming all of this at once.
Yeah. And then what do you think are the biggest challenges that the institutions are going to face with this?
We've heard the logistics, getting everybody on board. To give you an example of one of those logistical challenges is you are going to have to be communicating with your customers that suddenly you need to be receiving certain pieces of information or data from them in a structured manner. So that could be the postal address, for example. So there's a knock-on effect. And that knock-on effect is when suddenly you need a team across the bank or the payment service provider to really understand the implications and the roadmap of what's happening from the front all the way through to the back of the bank, and how all those systems are going to communicate with one another internally. Amongst that obviously been one kind of internal challenge you face with your customers, but then how you then communicate with your other counterparties, other financial intermediaries. Because we're talking about the Swift cross-border migration, but not to confuse matters, there are other domestic migrations happening. Like we've had one here in the UK, there's one bit in the US. One way to describe it, yes. So logistics has been a big challenge, and then really understanding, well, when are we actually going to start using the richer data, and what are those business benefits? When do we realize those business benefits of all that investment we've seen sunk into this program?
Yeah. And then what about sort of misconceptions? Are there many misconceptions out there regarding the changes coming?
Yes, there are. And I think misconceptions is one way to describe it. Another way is probably awareness. So we have a deadline next year. Now, the deadline, as I mentioned before, is focused on those instruction messages. But if you're not ready to send out the new format for the instruction messages, there are contingency measures in place. So another key message that we want to convey is that come December the 13th, we'll hear from Swift what are the costs associated with those contingency measures that they'll put in place, and what is the disincentive going to be? Because Swift have been very clear they're going to disincentivize banks from sending the old message over the Swift network after the deadline. So there's awareness around that. There's awareness around what some of these more technical terms mean. I'll lose you now if I start explaining what they are.
I'll tell you if you do.
Yeah. We start falling asleep. There are things like deprecation of messages. So that means you can still send these reporting messages, bank statements,
Yeah.
but they will no longer be supported.
Okay.
If they're no longer supported, that kind of creates a bit of a headache in the back office as well. So it's, contingency measures, it's the deprecation, it's things around sort of the more structured data elements that are coming into play from November 2026 onwards. But to maintain the focus on the here and now and what to do the next 12 months,
Yeah.
it really is focused on instructions. It's really focused on getting your ducks in a row internally and making sure you can be sending the new formatted messages.
Brilliant. No, you've explained that really well. Is there anything that we haven't touched on that you think is important to mention, or do you think that we've pretty much discussed and covered everything that we need to focus on for the transformation?
I think we've covered a lot of ground, but I would look at the next phases of the migration, so between now and next year, and then sort of work backwards. So have a look at what you need to do internally to be ready. And does that involve procuring a third party, a vendor? Is there going to be a contract in place? What does all of that mean to you and your organization? Then have a look at the adoption rates of the migration to this ISO 222 standard. And then also understand, okay, if you are going to be using the contingency measures, what does that mean to you and your financial relationships that you have? So to really get a holistic view of not just readiness, but also what does it mean, deprecation to your organization? What does it mean around contingency measures? And then actually, how are you gearing up to be ready next year? And what does that really involve kind of end to end in the bank? But otherwise, we covered a lot of ground in a short space of time.
You've explained it very well, because not an easy subject to be digesting for us. So thank you so much. And it sounds like we should be touching base again in a couple of weeks after we've had the update in December as well.
Absolutely.
Brilliant. Thanks very much for your time.
Thanks, Fiona.